Well, we're going to look at something that Jesus discussed and see what its application is for us in the 21st century. He used parables, he used examples to illustrate how his disciples should conduct themselves, and he's given us guidelines to follow. When we use these clear and concise directions, they always produce beneficial results. Most of us can probably think of examples in the past where maybe another member has said something to us or done something to us where we've been hurt or offended. I mean, you can't go along over a period of time without something invariably happening like that. And maybe it was purely unintentional. Well, if that's ever happened to you, there are some specific things that you can do to address this. Turn to Matthew 18. Matthew 18. And we're going to look at 3 verses that give you specific instructions of what you need to do if something like this happens to you. And as we read these 3 verses in Matthew 18, verses 15 through 17, I want you to ask yourselves, how many times have I actually taken the application of this scripture and actually used it in a specific instance since I've been in the church? Matthew 18, verse 15, and I'm reading from the New King James Version. Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Emphasis on the word alone. Go and talk to him about the problem or her directly, alone. Don't go out and talk to everyone in the church about the problem. Don't broadcast it. Take that person aside alone. And I don't know how many times I've heard this happen. I'm sure you have too, where you will walk down the aisle past a couple of people earnestly engaged in conversation of some kind. And you may overhear snatches and bits of it, but you can tell it's a really serious conversation. And you have to be careful about something like that, because you may inadvertently say something that will cause someone to pick up a word or two and distort the whole meaning of what is being discussed. Anyway, talk to him alone. If you're not sure you can have that kind of conversation in the congregation, go out and sit in the car. And if there are people parading back and forth, wondering what you're talking about, drive your car over to the other side of the lot where they can't be seen. But do it privately. If he hears you, and that doesn't mean like a man engaged in a sports program on television where there's a basketball game or a championship football game or something like that, and his wife comes in and says, "Honey, the house is on fire." And he says, "Well, go ahead, you take care of it." It's not like that hearing. He's heard words, but he didn't totally understand what she was saying. Otherwise, he would have taken a different kind of action or reacted differently. If he hears you, and you have to make sure that he understands what you're saying, if that happens, then you've gained your brother. a relationship that used to be strained, and when you'd see that person, you'd walk down one aisle to avoid him if he was on the other aisle or in the middle aisle, or you'd go out of your way if he was out in the foyer to stay up in the front part of the church. You would do that type of a thing. I mean, you would have that kind of action in your life because of that estrangement. You don't want that kind of relationship with your brothers, with your sisters. You want to be compatible. You want to be going in the same direction. And if you discuss the problem privately and he hears or she hears what you have to say, then you've gained your brother. You no longer have to stay on the other side of the building. This doesn't mean you say, oh, right on, I've just been waiting to tell old so-and-so a piece of my mind for all this stuff that's built up over the years. If that's the case, then you've waited too long. If you plan to be effective, then you need to approach your brother right away. You can't wait for 2 years when the event is so far removed from what he remembers about it or she remembers about it. It won't have the same relevance, even though it's been gnawing on you and burning at your stomach for that period of time. Of course, there's an exception to this, and that's if something comes to your attention that happened several years ago, but you didn't know about it until it comes back around full circle. Something in your family happens, and then you find out it's because of this or that. If it happens 2 years ago, you should have talked to that person 2 years ago and not let it eat on you and gnaw on you until it finally erupts and causes you to say or do something that you may later regret. Don't say, I'm going to go over there tonight. I'm going to tell so-and-so a piece of my mind about this. You know, if you have those kinds of feelings, then you've let the sun go down on your wrath a little too often. Too many times, as Paul stated in Ephesians 4, verse 26. He says, be you angry. You can be angry. Christ was angry when he drove the money changers out of the temple. There's nothing wrong with being angry at certain things, at certain events. But don't let it build up in you. Don't let the sun go down, and don't you be tossing and turning at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, fretting about something that you should have resolved earlier in the day. You've let too much build up. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're tossing and turning at midnight or 1 o'clock that you suddenly get up and say, I can't take this any longer, I'm going to get this settled tonight. Because you can't get out of a deep sleep and then go knock on your brother's door, wake him up and say, I'm sorry, but we need to discuss this right now. It can't wait any longer. Needless to say, someone coming to the door, very tired, maybe just having been interrupted out of his deep REMs, you know, the rapid eye movement type of sleep, where you're in your very deepest, which is usually before midnight, I guess. He's not going to be too kindly to have someone confront him in that type of environment. So you have to use common sense, obviously. And perhaps I'm overdoing some of this, but I think you get the point. You know, approach the person for a discussion when you're feeling good. And don't go when you're upset about something else in your life, or you're tired, or you're worried. Because that in itself is going to be ineffective. It's going to affect your presentation. You're going to be distracted. And as a result, it's not going to be very effective. And it'll suffer as a result. Of course, this is where you have to be very careful. I'm not saying you walk on eggshells, so much so that you don't really get out what you intend to say, that you're indecisive about it, that you're ineffective. But on the other hand, you shouldn't approach it like a bull in the proverbial bull in the china shop who just rushes in and everything scatters and explodes. He's swishing his tail and waving his horns and knocking teacups and everything all over. It reminds me a little bit of something I heard a number of years ago, and I'm sure a number of you have probably heard it one time or the other, about this man that was driving along a country road one evening, and all of a sudden he hears, and he realizes he has a flat tire. So, okay, I think this can be handled pretty well. So he hops out, goes to the trunk, there's his spare, but he doesn't have a jack. He was moving something the week before and he left the jack out and forgot it. So he's a little perplexed and he thinks about it, but he sees this dim light in the, down the road, and he thinks, well, there's a farmhouse there, and I probably will be able to find a farmer, someone that I can borrow a jack from. So he starts walking toward that light. And as he goes, his mind starts turning over a number of things. Well, what if that farmer won't answer the door when I knock? Maybe he's in a deep, sound sleep. Or what if he hears my knock, but he's suspicious because it's so late at night and he thinks I'm there to rob him or do violence of some kind. And, he keeps having these thoughts go through his mind. And the longer he walks, the more worked up he gets about it. And he thinks, well, why is he thinking this? What right does he have to think of this about me? He doesn't know who I am, and yet he's going to have all these kind of reactions. Finally, he's absolutely fuming inside. He gets to the porch, stomps up on the porch, knocks on the door. No answer. And that makes him even madder. So he knocks again really hard. No answer. Finally, he just gets ready to bang the door. When the door opens, a farmer in his pajamas stands there smiling at him and says, "Want to borrow a jack?" That's sometimes how we are about things. We get so worked up and we anticipate the absolute worst so many times that we are ineffective when you go into a situation. We expect the absolute worst, and if you expect it, that's what you'll get. You should go into a conversation like the one I'm describing or trying to describe with a mild and a meek approach and say, I've been having this problem for some time, and it's really affecting me, and I want to talk to you about it. You might even say it's very difficult for you to talk about it. And if the person wouldn't mind, could you start the conversation with a prayer about it? That would help both of you. Maybe someone has borrowed your lawnmower and hasn't returned it. And now the grass in your backyard is so high that you haven't seen the family dog for a week, and he's out there someplace because every once in a while you hear a little feeble bark and see a little rustling of the grass. Or maybe someone has insulted you, or someone and so that you or someone in your family, I'm thinking here in a case where maybe it's a child involved and where you have to be the spokesperson for that child. What do you do? Well, not to overdo it, but it says, this verse says, take them aside privately to discuss it and tell them, how it's affected you. Ask them, in the case of the lawnmower, to return it by next weekend, or to be a little more careful about what they say in the future. And like I said before, don't do this in church where other members around might overhear it, only hear part of it, and build it up into something that perhaps it isn't, which may be more damaging in the long run than the actual facts and the truth itself. This is a private matter between you and the other person and should remain a private matter. Do not go out and complain about what has happened to other members. It's like I heard someone say recently, people come up and vomit all over me. And that was kind of the reaction the person had about the type of stuff that got unloaded on them. We don't want to have that happen to us, and we shouldn't want to do it to other people. They unload all of their grievances, and it's not going to do any good. It may be kind of a catharsis or a cleansing for them. It may help them get it out of their system, but until the person who's affected directly hears it, it's not going to be any good. Now, does this mean you can't confide in someone else? And I want to make a distinction here, too. There's certainly nothing wrong in confiding with anyone else here, especially if they're, one of your best friends. But it should be about something external to the church. We all have problems. I've had problems in the past with our employers, our bosses, that type of thing. And most people have that in common. They can identify with and maybe give you advice. If your employer happens to be a church member, then that's something totally different. I guess a good rule of thumb when you're talking about this type of thing is simply this. It's common sense, and you've heard it before. Don't say something else. Don't say something to someone else that you wouldn't say to the person directly. We've all been guilty of, we can really gnaw on someone when we're talking with our friend, but we wouldn't have the guts to say it to them directly if they were there. You should be able to talk to them in the same way you talk to your friend about whatever the problem is. If you can't, then you shouldn't be talking about it at all. When someone does something and they come to the minister to tell them, the first thing that we should do is we should direct them to Matthew 18 and say, have you talked to that person yourself? Have you done the steps? Have you taken the steps that Jesus directed you to do here? Talk to him or her. And if they haven't, then we should tell them, well, you should do that. And not only just the first step, but there's a second step. If the concern is simply a passing irritation, the offended one may feel, it's not enough of a bother to go through the awkward part of going to their brother and going through all of this. But if the members will decide to skip these steps, going directly to the minister should not be encouraged at all. If it's of a real concern, they ought to take these 2 steps. You know, God doesn't like murmuring, and if we want it stopped, then this verse makes it more difficult to take place if it's being followed. Now, if it's a situation where maybe because of past history, the other person has a tendency toward violence or may become violent, then of course that's entirely different. And I'm covering, I think, what would be 95% of the ordinary types of things that could be handled between 2 people. There are the exceptions, and if in your mind it is an exception, then of course you should go to the minister. But absent that, and you really should think carefully, you know, am I putting myself in harm's way by approaching this person about this? Is it the type of thing that's inflammatory that may cause, you know, possible violence? If you really feel that way, then of course go to the minister. You would think that wouldn't happen in the church, but from past experience, I know it is possible. You know, when someone's allowed to bypass the first 2 steps and go directly to the minister, it produces a really unhealthy environment. The more someone complains, the more power they feel they have. And if we as the ministry responds by calling in the one being complained about for correction, the complainer receives a real payoff because of those actions. You know, if we say to someone, well, someone has called me about this or talked to me about you, but they don't reveal who it is, the complainer is the one that's rewarded. The complainer is the one that's recognized. And the recipient may begin to distrust anyone that they've talked to or confided in. They become suspicious about a church that's supposed to be a haven for security, protective sanctuary, but now to them becomes a totally unsafe place. And ultimately, the end result of that is often people will leave and won't return because they feel where there should be a loving, caring congregation, it's now no longer that way. Verse 16, and this is the second step. But if he will not hear, take with you 1 or 2 more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And that's taken from Deuteronomy 19, verse 15, where it says, 1 witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin, in any sin that he sinneth, and the mouth, or at the mouth of 2 witnesses, or at the mouth of 3 witnesses, shall the matter be established. And that's a safe, it's a safeguard for everyone, but it helps confirm to the minister, if this actually gets back to them, that yes, I went and talked to the person alone, no results. 2, I took someone with me, and they can verify what was said. They can verify the way it was approached. They can verify the environment and the atmosphere. I think this may be a little more difficult for some people because they may be tempted to take their best friend. And of course, there's actually nothing wrong with this. with this one proviso, as long as that person can be, one, unbiased, and two, totally objective. And sometimes that's difficult to do when it's someone you know really well. I'd say try to take people that aren't necessarily your buddies or close friends, who are already biased and may be sympathetic to what is going on just because they know you. But try to take maybe one or two people in the congregation who, or deacons or deaconesses or leading men that you've known for a long time, and they've demonstrated over that time because of their actions they're truly converted. You want someone with you who falls into that category. Then meet with the person again with your witness and go over, what you went over the first time. If that doesn't produce results, then and only then should you take the final step in this process, and that would be to go to the minister with the problem. But like I said, that's after you've completed steps 1 and 2. Verse 17, and if he refuses to hear them, that's the people going, that's you along with your witness, then tell it to the church or the ministry. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. Do steps 1 and 2, and then finally go to the minister. The obvious end of the process. And this is, like I say, this is Jesus giving these instructions based on something that was enunciated in the Old Testament. So it wasn't something new. It's something, was a process that had been around a long time. It's just in this day and age, I wonder how many of us have actually followed that. In a situation like this, then the minister has to make a judgment. Maybe it's so serious, if it's flagrant and egregious type of a sin, for example, maybe the person would be disfellowshipped, or maybe just asked to not attend church for a while he thinks about what he's done or she's done. And I know in thinking about this, if I was listening to myself, I would think this whole process seems a little harsh. I know it seems harsh to me when I'm speaking it, but if you really think about it, it protects everyone involved, the person who's accusing, the accused, the ministry, and the church. While we're here, I'd like to read a couple other verses, a few verses removed, beginning in verse 21, which adds a little something to what I've just said. Then Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Here's the impetuous Peter, the one that wanted to walk on the water, the one that was going to defend Christ, the one that didn't want him to wash his feet. I mean, he was this in-your-face type of guy. So here he comes and says, well, how often? There's got to be a limit as to how often I'll forgive my brother. He said up to 7 times. He wanted a precise box. It was black and white, how long, how short. And supposing this box was divided into 7 cubicles, and each time his brother sinned against him, he pulled out one of them. Down to 6. Waited. Another time, another one goes out till finally he was down to the last one. He thinks, you just do it one more time and that's it. I mean, he had that kind of thinking. He was trying to break it down to something very precise. And Jesus said, Verse 22, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70. And Peter probably thought, well, okay, he's multiplied it times 10. That's, 70, I guess I could go with that. That's a little longer, but I can divide my box up into 70 little cubicles. But that wasn't what he said. He said 70 times 7. So now he had to divide that box up into 490 cubicles per person. Some husbands and wives, probably in the first 6 months of marriage, if they were doing this, they would have used up all 490 cubicles in their boxes. Jesus is showing by this example that we need to strive to have the same infinite capacity to forgive as he did. If you think of all the heinous acts and atrocities committed by man against their fellow man or over the years, and yet he has had and will have the capacity to forgive them. This past week I watched a documentary of what happened when the Allies liberated a concentration camp, Dachau, in World War II Germany after the war. And there was one thing that was very poignant, very graphic, and very emotional. He told about when the GIs came to the women's part of the prison and saw these emaciated creatures. They were women, but you couldn't tell by their looks or their size or their figure or their shape. With these rags on them, they were so repulsed by the condition that some of them just had to turn aside and throw up. That's how it affected them. They couldn't believe what they had seen. Many of the liberated Jews after the war, when they returned home where they thought they'd be welcomed, their homes had been confiscated by their neighbors, and in some cases they were killed. And this documentary wasn't dwelling so much on the camps, but was talking about their repatriation after the war and how difficult it was for them to find a home and how difficult it was for them even to be able to return, or not return, but go to Israel because of some of the limitations that had been placed on them. You think of Hitler's mark in the pages of history and all the other despots who over the years have done this type of thing, and yet they can be forgiven. Jesus has given us an example to use for dealing with sins that our brothers or sisters commit against us. It's there for us to use. Be sure to use it wisely and follow all of the steps in the prescribed manner and not leave any of them out. If you do, you will enjoy the benefit of the results, and it will help to cement any differences between you and your brother. And I say, over and above all that we have discussed, we need to remember the mercy that God has extended to us. And when it's all said and done, never forget to extend that same mercy to our brothers and our sisters as well.